21 years old. Clara Bennett was homeless with only $5 left, and she spent it on an abandoned ranger station deep in the Montana mountains. People called the place cursed, but after hiking 15 miles through snow to reach it, Clara discovered something hidden inside a locked cabinet untouched for over 50 years. A missing ranger's handwritten letter. A secret no one was supposed to find, and enough money to change her life forever. But the deeper Clara uncovered the truth about Blackthorn Mountain, the more she realized the cabin wasn't abandoned at all, and what happened there after midnight would leave her speechless. At 21 years old, Clara Bennett had mastered the art of disappearing. She slept in bus stations where nobody learned your name, washed her clothes in gas station sinks, and carried her entire life inside a faded green backpack that smelled like smoke and pine needles. Most nights, she told herself she preferred it that way. No attachments, no expectations, no one left to disappoint her. But the truth was harder to admit. Clara wasn't wandering because she wanted adventure. She was wandering because she had nowhere left to go. After losing her mother to cancer 2 years earlier, every piece of stability in her life collapsed like rotten wood in a storm. Bills swallowed the family trailer in Oregon. Friends slowly stopped answering her calls. Seasonal jobs came and went. By the start of winter, she had exactly $5 left to her name. Then she found the listing. An abandoned ranger station buried deep in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. No electricity, no road access, no nearby town for miles. The government described it as unsafe and uninhabitable. The asking price was $5. Most people would have laughed and kept scrolling. But Clara stared at the screen with her heart pounding, because for the first time in years, something in the world felt like it was calling her. 3 days after finding the listing, Clara Bennett boarded a nearly empty bus heading west across Montana with a backpack on her shoulders and fear sitting heavily in her chest. Outside the scratched bus window, the world slowly transformed from crowded highways into endless stretches of frozen wilderness. Small towns disappeared. Gas stations became rare. Mountains rose like giant shadows against the gray November sky. Most passengers slept during the ride. Clara couldn't. She kept rereading the printed auction page folded inside her jacket pocket. U.S. Forestry, property number 7714, former Blackthorn Ranger Station, remote access only, condemned since 1974, purchase price $5. Every time she looked at the words, her stomach tightened. Part of her knew this was insane. She had no vehicle, no savings, no backup plan. If anything went wrong out there, nobody would even know where to look for her. But another part of her, the deeper part she had spent years trying to silence, felt strangely calm. For the first time since her mother died, Clara wasn't running away from something. She was moving towards something. The bus dropped her near a forgotten roadside stop outside the tiny mountain town of Darrow Creek just before sunset. Population 83. The cold hit her immediately. Sharp, bitter, alive. Snow covered the edges of the road in dirty white piles, and the surrounding pine forests looked almost black beneath the darkening sky. Clara adjusted her backpack straps and walked into town, passing a diner, a closed bait shop, and a tiny grocery store with flickering lights in the window. Inside the store, an elderly cashier glanced at the rope, camping gear, and hatchet hanging from her pack. "You hunting?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "Bought an old ranger station up in Blackthorn Valley." The man froze. For a second, even the sound of the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to disappear. "You mean that cursed place?" he asked quietly. Clara forced a small laugh. "Cursed?" The cashier stared at her for a long moment before leaning closer. People avoid those mountains for a reason. Last ranger stationed there vanished back in the 70s. Cabin's been abandoned ever since. Clara felt a chill crawl across her skin that had nothing to do with the cold. What happened to him? Nobody knows. The man shrugged slowly. Some say he walked into the woods during a blizzard and never came back. Others say he lost his mind living alone out there. He lowered his voice even further. Folks around here think the mountain keeps what belongs to it. Clara swallowed hard. Then she paid for a loaf of bread, canned soup, batteries, and the cheapest coffee on the shelf. Because despite the fear twisting inside her, she still planned to go. The next morning, she began the hike. The first 8 miles followed an abandoned forestry road buried beneath patches of snow and fallen branches. The silence felt unnatural. No cars, no voices, only the crunch of boots against frozen earth and the distant cries of ravens circling overhead. By noon, freezing wind swept through the valley hard enough to sting her face raw. Still, Clara kept climbing. Her boots soaked through crossing icy streams. Her shoulders burned beneath the weight of her backpack. Twice she slipped on loose rock and nearly tumbled down narrow slopes. But she refused to stop, because every mile behind her felt like another mile separating her from the broken life she never wanted to return to. As evening approached, the old forestry road disappeared completely beneath snowdrifts. Ahead of her, only a narrow mountain trail remained, winding upward through thick pine forest toward the higher ridges. That's when she found the warning sign. It leaned sideways beside the trail, half buried in snow. Danger. Structures unsafe for entry area closed by county order. Below the warning, someone had scratched 3 words into the wood long ago. Let it die. Clara stared at the message for several seconds. Most people would have turned around right there. And honestly, part of her wanted to. The mountain suddenly felt enormous, watching her. The fading daylight, the freezing wind, the endless forest pressing in from every direction, it all made her feel painfully small. She could still leave. She could hike back down before dark, catch another bus, find another shelter, another temporary job, another endless cycle of surviving without actually living. But then she remembered the nights sleeping on cold station benches, the humiliation of pretending not to be hungry, the feeling of becoming invisible everywhere she went, and something inside her hardened. No, she whispered aloud into the empty wilderness. Then she stepped past the sign. The final 6 miles nearly broke her. The trail climbed steeply into higher elevation where snow covered everything in thick white layers. Wind screamed through the trees like distant voices. Darkness fell quickly beneath the heavy storm clouds rolling over the mountains. By the time Clara reached the summit ridge, she could barely feel her fingers. Then she saw it. Far below in the valley, a faint shape stood among the trees. The ranger station. Even from a distance, it looked abandoned by the world itself. The roof sagged beneath decades of storms. One side of the porch had partially collapsed. The old fire lookout tower behind the cabin leaned dangerously against the sky like a dying skeleton. Yet somehow, the cabin was still standing. Clara felt tears sting her eyes before she even understood why. Because at that moment, staring down into that frozen valley, she realized something terrifying. That broken old ranger station looked exactly how she felt inside. Forgotten. Weathered. Left behind by everyone else. And maybe that was why she couldn't walk away from it. The final stretch downhill happened in near darkness. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she crossed the clearing toward the cabin porch. Wind rattled loose boards somewhere above her head. Everything smelled like frozen pine and ancient wood. For a long moment, Clara simply stood there, staring at the old front door. Then she slowly reached for the rusted handle. Locked. Of course it was locked. She leaned her forehead against the cold wood and laughed bitterly to herself. $5 well spent, she muttered. But when she stepped back, something caught her eye. Hanging beside the doorway, hidden beneath years of dust and cobwebs, was a small rusted key. Clara's fingers trembled as she pulled the rusted key from the nail beside the door. For a moment, she simply stared at it. The metal was ice cold against her skin, darkened with age and spotted with corrosion, as though it had been hanging there untouched for decades, waiting. Wind hissed through the trees behind her. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch cracked. Clara swallowed hard and pushed the key into the lock. At first, nothing happened. Then, click! The sound echoed through the silent valley like the cabin itself had just taken its first breath in 50 years. The door groaned open slowly. A wave of stale air rolled out into the freezing night. Dust, old wood, smoke long buried in the walls, and something else, something strangely warm beneath it all. Clara stepped inside cautiously, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam revealed a single-room cabin frozen in time. An iron stove stood near the far wall, covered in rust. A narrow cot still held a folded wool blanket, stiff with age. Tin coffee cups rested on a shelf exactly where someone had left them decades earlier. Maps curled on the walls beneath layers of dust. It looked less abandoned, and more interrupted, as if whoever lived there had expected to come back. A shiver ran down Clara's spine. She closed the door behind her and stood in silence. The storm outside intensified, wind hammering against the cabin walls hard enough to make the windows rattle. Snow whipped against the glass. She realized something terrifying. If she hadn't reached the station before nightfall, she probably would have frozen to death outside. Clara dropped her backpack near the stove and searched the cabin for firewood. In a small storage room behind the kitchen area, she found an old stack of dry pine logs surprisingly untouched by moisture. Within 20 minutes, flames crackled inside the iron stove. Warmth slowly spread through the cabin. For the first time in months, Clara felt safe. Exhaustion crashed into her all at once. She sat on the floor near the fire eating cold canned soup straight from the tin, staring around the dim room while snowstorms screamed outside the windows. That's when she noticed it. In the far corner of the cabin, a tall steel cabinet stood against the wall. Unlike everything else in the room, it looked untouched. No rust, no dust covering the handles. And strangely, there were scratches around the lock, as though someone had tried to force it open years ago. Clara's heartbeat slowed. Something about the cabinet felt wrong, or important. She grabbed the flashlight and walked toward it carefully. The cabinet doors were locked tight. Above it hung an old Forest Service calendar from 1973, still open to the month of January. January, the month the ranger disappeared. Clara stared at the cabinet for several seconds before trying the small keyring she had found by the front door. The second key fit. Another loud metallic click echoed through the cabin. The doors creaked open. Inside were dozens of neatly stacked topographic maps tied with faded leather straps, old journals, weather reports, search and rescue logs dating back decades. But behind them, hidden on the lowest shelf, were 3 canvas bags. Clara frowned. They looked heavy. Carefully, she pulled one onto the floor. The fabric felt stiff with age. Her fingers struggled to untie the brittle cord wrapped around the opening. Then the bag fell open. Clara froze. Stacks of cash spilled across the wooden floorboards. Old bills. Hundreds. 50s. 20s bound together with faded bank straps. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe. "No way," she whispered. Hands shaking violently now. She opened the second bag. More money. The third bag. Even more. Her pulse thundered inside her ears. The fire crackled behind her as she sat surrounded by stacks of forgotten cash in the middle of a condemned ranger station buried deep in the Montana wilderness. It didn't feel real. It felt like something from a dream. Or a trap. Clara forced herself to breathe and searched the cabinet again. That's when she found the letter. A weathered leather envelope tucked behind the shelves. On the front, written in faded ink, were 6 words. For whoever finds this place. Clara slowly opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter dated January 18th, 1973. The signature at the bottom read, Elias Mercer, Blackthorn Mountain Ranger. Clara sat beside the fire and began to read. If you are reading this, then the mountain finally allowed someone else to reach this station. I do not know your name, or what kind of life forced you here. But if you walked all this way through snow and silence, then I believe you already understand something most people never will. Loneliness is not the same as being alone. Clara's chest tightened. Outside, the storm roared louder. She kept reading. Elias wrote about spending 13 winters alone in the mountains, protecting forests nobody seemed to care about anymore. He wrote about watching the modern world slowly erase places like Blackthorn from memory. Then came the sentence that made Clara's blood run cold. The forestry department ordered this station abandoned after the winter deaths of 1972. Officially, they blamed avalanches. Unofficially, they were afraid of what people were seeing in these mountains. Clara looked up sharply. The cabin suddenly felt much quieter. The fire popped behind her. She continued reading. Elias described strange lights appearing deep in the forest during snowstorms. Voices heard outside the station at night when no footprints appeared in the snow. Hikers vanishing without explanation. But the final pages changed completely. The fear disappeared from his writing. Instead, the letter became deeply personal. If you found the money, keep it. The government doesn't deserve it. Neither do the men who abandoned this place. I stayed because these mountains saved my life when the world outside nearly destroyed it. Maybe they brought you here for the same reason. Tears blurred Clara's vision, because somehow, a man dead for 50 years had just described her perfectly. Then she reached the final line, and her entire body went cold. One more thing. If the lookout tower light turns on after midnight, do not go outside. Clara stared at the final sentence of Elias Mercer's letter while the fire crackled weakly beside her. If the lookout tower light turns on after midnight, do not go outside. The words shouldn't have affected her the way they did. It sounded ridiculous. A ghost story. The kind of creepy warning lonely mountain towns invent to entertain tourists during winter. And yet, something deep inside her refused to laugh. Outside, snow slammed against the cabin windows hard enough to shake the glass. The storm had become violent now, swallowing the entire valley in white darkness. Clara folded the letter carefully and placed it beside her backpack. Then she looked toward the small window facing the old lookout tower. Nothing. Just darkness and snow. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the cabin from somewhere beyond the trees. She hated that feeling, because Clara Bennett had spent most of her life learning not to be afraid. Fear didn't help when your electricity got shut off. Fear didn't help when landlords pounded on doors demanding rent. Fear didn't help when you slept alone in bus stations pretending not to notice drunk men staring at you from across the room. Fear was a luxury for people who had protection. Clara survived because she learned to keep moving. But sitting inside that forgotten ranger station, listening to the mountain storm surround her from every direction, she felt small again, human again. And for the first time in years, she admitted something to herself she had never dared say out loud. She was tired. Tired of surviving. Tired of carrying her entire life on her back. Tired of pretending loneliness made her strong. The realization hit her harder than the cold ever could, because somewhere along the way, Clara had stopped believing she deserved a real life. She had convinced herself that merely surviving each day was enough. The mountains were forcing her to confront that lie. Near midnight, the storm finally quieted. The sudden silence felt eerie. Clara sat upright immediately. No wind, no snow, nothing. The kind of silence so complete it almost felt unnatural. Then, a light appeared outside. Clara's breath caught, far beyond the cabin window, high above the trees. The lookout tower glowed faintly against the darkness. A pale golden light flickered inside the glass observation room at the top. Clara froze. "No," she whispered. Her mind raced for explanations. Maybe moonlight reflecting off snow. Maybe an electrical malfunction. Maybe another hiker. But deep down, she knew none of those answers made sense. There was no electricity anywhere near Blackthorn Valley, and the tower had been abandoned for 50 years. The light flickered once, then stayed steady. Clara slowly stood from the floor. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside. But another feeling rose stronger. Curiosity. The same dangerous curiosity that had brought her into the mountains in the first place. She stepped closer to the window. The tower stood motionless beneath the stars. The glowing light inside looked warm, inviting, almost alive. Then Clara noticed something that made her stomach drop. There were footprints outside the cabin. Fresh footprints in the snow, leading from the tree line, straight toward the tower. Clara grabbed her flashlight instantly. Her pulse hammered in her chest. The footprints were impossible. She had checked outside before the storm ended. The valley had been untouched. No tracks, no people. And now someone or something had crossed the clearing without making a sound. She remembered Elias's warning. Do not go outside. But Clara had spent too much of her life obeying fear. Fear had already taken enough from her. Before she could stop herself, she pulled on her coat, grabbed the lantern from the wall, and opened the cabin door. The cold hit her immediately, sharp enough to burn her lungs. The clearing lay silent beneath fresh snow reflecting silver moonlight. Pine trees stood perfectly still around the valley, and the footprints were real. Clara followed them carefully. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The sound of her boots echoed through the frozen night as she crossed the clearing toward the lookout tower. With every step, the fear inside her grew stronger, not because she thought something supernatural waited ahead, but because she realized something worse. She didn't know who she would be anymore if this place changed her completely. For years, the world had taught Clara to think of herself as temporary, disposable, someone who drifted through life unnoticed. But standing in that valley beneath endless stars, she suddenly felt connected to something larger than herself for the very first time. The mountains didn't care about her past. They didn't care that she had been homeless. They didn't care about debt, failure, shame, or all the invisible scars she carried. The wilderness simply asked one question: will you stay? Clara reached the base of the tower. The wooden structure groaned softly in the cold wind. Above her, the lantern light still glowed inside the observation room. She looked up the endless staircase spiraling into darkness. Then she noticed something carved into one of the wooden support beams. Words, old and faded. She raised the flashlight closer. The carving read, "The mountain only speaks to the lost." Clara felt tears sting her eyes instantly, because suddenly, everything made sense. Elias Mercer hadn't stayed here because he was escaping life. He stayed because this place healed him. And maybe that was why Clara had been pulled here too. Not for the money, not for survival, but because some broken part of her had been searching for silence strong enough to hear herself again. For years, the world had reduced her life to survival statistics. Homeless. Poor. Forgotten. But standing beneath that tower, Clara realized she was still capable of becoming someone new. The mountain hadn't trapped her here. It had rescued her. A sudden gust of wind swept through the valley. The light inside the tower flickered violently. Then, it vanished. Complete darkness. Clara stared upward, breathing hard. The tower was empty again. Silent, as if nothing had ever been there. Slowly, snow began falling once more. Clara looked back toward the tiny cabin glowing warmly across the clearing. And for the first time since her mother died, the word home no longer felt impossible. The next morning, Clara woke to sunlight pouring through the cabin windows. For a few seconds, she forgot where she was. Then the smell of pine smoke reached her. The crackling stove, the snow-covered mountains outside, and the letter from Elias Mercer resting beside her backpack. Everything came rushing back. Clara sat up slowly beneath the old wool blanket she had found folded near the cot. Her body ached from the hike, but something inside her felt strangely lighter. For the first time in years, she hadn't woken up afraid. No crowded shelter. No strangers yelling in the middle of the night. No fear of being told to leave. Just silence. Deep, endless mountain silence. She stepped outside carrying a steaming tin cup of coffee made from supplies she found stored in old metal containers near the stove. The air was painfully cold, but beautiful. Overnight, fresh snow had transformed Blackthorn Valley into something almost unreal. Sunlight spilled across the mountains like liquid gold. The old lookout tower stood silent above the clearing. No mysterious light. No footprints. Only stillness. Clara walked slowly through the snow, studying the property in daylight for the first time. The ranger station was in rough condition, but not beyond saving. The roof sagged in places. One section of porch railing had collapsed completely. Several windows were cracked, but the bones of the cabin remained strong. And just like her, that thought surprised her. For so long, Clara had seen herself as damaged beyond repair. Every rejection, every sleepless night, every humiliation had slowly convinced her she was broken. But Blackthorn changed the way she saw things. The cabin wasn't ruined because it had scars. It was still standing because it survived them. That realization stayed with her all morning. Inside the storage shed behind the station, Clara found old forestry tools still hanging neatly on the walls. Axes, saws, rope, lanterns, even boxes of rusted nails untouched for decades. Elias Mercer had preserved everything carefully, as if he believed someone would eventually need them again. And maybe he had. By noon, Clara made a decision that terrified her. She wasn't leaving. Not in a few days. Not after winter. Not ever. The thought should have scared her more than it did. Instead, it felt like relief. That afternoon, she began cleaning the station properly. She swept decades of dust from the floors, cleared broken branches from the porch, repaired gaps in the windows using old wood panels she found stacked behind the shed. The work exhausted her physically, but emotionally, it healed something inside her, because every repaired board felt like proof that abandoned things could still matter. As the days passed, Clara settled into a rhythm unlike anything she had ever experienced before. Mornings started before sunrise. She hauled water from the creek, chopped wood, cooked simple meals over the iron stove. Afternoons became dedicated to rebuilding the station little by little. Some days she repaired walls. Other days she climbed the lookout tower to clean shattered glass and remove years of bird nests from the observation room. At night, she sat beside the fire reading Elias Mercer's journals. Those journals changed everything. Page after page revealed the story of a man who had once arrived at Blackthorn Valley completely broken himself. Elias had been a war veteran. According to his writings, he came to the mountains after returning home, unable to reconnect with normal life. Noise overwhelmed him. Crowds terrified him. He described feeling invisible even when surrounded by people, until the mountains saved him. The deeper Clara read, the more she realized something extraordinary. She wasn't alone in her loneliness. People like her had always existed. Lost souls searching for quiet places to rebuild themselves far away from the expectations of the world. One journal entry stopped her cold. The wilderness does not judge people the way society does. Out here, nobody cares who you used to be. The mountain only asks whether you are willing to keep going. Clara read that sentence 3 times, because no one had ever given her permission to start over before. Not really. The outside world branded people permanently. Homeless, failure, mentally unstable, indisposable. But Blackthorn Valley erased labels. Out there, survival depended on effort, patience, courage, and resilience, not social status. And for the first time in years, Clara realized she was actually good at surviving. Weeks turned into months. Winter deepened around the station, but Clara adapted quickly. She learned which trees burned hottest, which trails stayed safest after snowfall, how to spot incoming storms by watching cloud patterns above the ridges. The mountains slowly accepted her. And something else changed too. Clara began smiling again. Not fake smiles used to make strangers comfortable. Real ones. The kind that appeared naturally when sunlight hit fresh snow, or when she managed to fix something with her own hands. One evening near Christmas, Clara climbed the lookout tower carrying a lantern and one of Elias's journals. The valley below glowed silver beneath moonlight. For miles in every direction, there was nothing except untouched wilderness. No traffic, no noise, no reminders of the life she lost. And standing there high above the forest, Clara suddenly understood something profound. She had spent years believing she needed society to save her. A better job, more money, someone to rescue her. But the mountains had taught her a different truth. Sometimes healing begins the moment you stop waiting for permission to exist. Tears filled her eyes as she looked across the endless wilderness. Because for the first time since her mother died, she could finally imagine a future again. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, but a meaningful one. And that changed everything. By the middle of January, Blackthorn Valley no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. Every morning, Clara woke before sunrise to the sound of wind moving through the pines and the slow crackling of the iron stove beside her bed. The station had become more than shelter now. It had rhythm, memory, presence, and somehow it felt like the mountain was watching her. Not in a threatening way, in a waiting way, like Blackthorn had been silent for decades simply because it had been waiting for someone willing to listen again. Clara spent most days restoring the ranger station piece by piece. She repaired sections of the roof before heavier snow arrived. She reinforced the tower staircase using old timber from the collapsed woodshed. She even began organizing Elias Mercer's journals chronologically, slowly piecing together the story of his final winter at Blackthorn. That was when things started becoming strange again. At first, it was small. She would hear footsteps outside at night only to find untouched snow in the morning. Sometimes the tower light flickered briefly after midnight before disappearing. Once, while reading near the stove, Clara could have sworn she heard a voice upstairs whisper her name. But every time she searched the station, nothing. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing feeling that Elias Mercer's story was incomplete. One night during a snowstorm, Clara finally discovered why. The storm hit just after dark. Heavy wind slammed against the cabin walls hard enough to shake the windows. Snow poured from the sky in thick waves, swallowing the entire valley in white darkness. Clara sat near the stove reading one of Elias's older journals when something slipped loose from the back cover and landed on the floor. A photograph. She picked it up carefully. The image showed 3 men standing beside the lookout tower sometime in the late 1960s. One was clearly Elias Younger, wearing a forestry uniform, but it was the second man that caught her attention. Tall, thin, wearing a dark suit completely out of place for the wilderness. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Federal Survey Team, Summer 1968. Below that, one sentence scratched in hurried handwriting. They found something under the mountain. Clara's pulse quickened instantly. She grabbed the remaining journals and searched frantically for references to the survey team. At first, nothing appeared. Then, finally, buried deep inside a journal from October 1968, she found an entry Elias had partially blacked out using thick ink. But parts remained readable. They arrived without warning. Government vehicles, scientists, armed escorts. They closed the northern ridge for 12 days. Whatever they uncovered beneath Blackthorn terrified them enough to erase all records afterward. Clara sat frozen beside the fire, under the mountain. What did that even mean? Mining, military testing, something buried. The wind outside screamed louder. She kept reading. Another entry. The men from Washington warned me not to discuss the tunnel system. They claimed it was unstable. But unstable things do not require armed guards. Clara slowly lowered the journal. Tunnel system. Her mind raced. That explained something she had noticed weeks earlier. Half a mile north of the station near the frozen creek, she had found strange metal stakes hammered into the ground in perfectly straight lines. At the time, she assumed they were old survey markers. Now she wasn't so sure. Then she found the final entry, dated only 3 days before Elias Mercer vanished. I went back to the tunnel tonight. I should not have. There are sounds down there now. And lights. Something was sealed inside Blackthorn Mountain long before we ever arrived. A violent bang against the cabin wall made Clara jump. The lantern flickered. Outside, the storm intensified. And then, the tower light turned on again. Clara's breathing stopped. The pale, golden glow burned brighter than ever through the storm, cutting across the valley like a signal. But this time, something was different. There was a figure standing inside the tower. Clara shot to her feet. A silhouette, tall, motionless, watching the cabin. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. "No," she whispered. The figure didn't move. For one terrifying moment, Clara considered barricading the door and waiting until morning. But then something impossible happened. The light inside the tower flashed 3 times. Pause. Then flashed 3 more. A pattern. A signal. Clara frowned suddenly. Morse code. She recognized it because her mother had taught her basic emergency signaling when she was a child. 3 flashes. Pause. 3 flashes again. The same message repeating. SOS. Clara grabbed the lantern instantly. Every survival instinct screamed not to go outside. But another thought overpowered the fear. What if someone was actually trapped up there? The storm nearly knocked her sideways the moment she stepped outside. Snow blasted across the clearing so hard she could barely see the tower through the darkness. Still, the light continued flashing. SOS, SOS. Clara fought her way through knee-deep snow toward the staircase. The wooden steps groaned beneath her boots as she climbed higher and higher into the freezing wind. 30 feet, 40, 50. The tower swayed slightly during stronger gusts. Her lantern flickered wildly. Then she reached the top. The observation room door stood half open. The light inside glowed softly. Clara pushed the door wider and froze. The room was empty. No person. No footprints. Nothing except an old battery-powered lantern sitting on the floor. A lantern that should not have worked after 50 years. Her hands shook violently now. Then she noticed something beside it, freshly scratched into the dusty wooden floorboards. He never left the mountain. Clara stumbled backward in horror, and suddenly, she heard it. Not outside, not below, but beneath her feet. A low metallic sound echoing from somewhere deep underground, like an enormous steel door slowly creaking open beneath Blackthorn Valley. The sound beneath the tower lasted only a few seconds, but it changed Clara forever. A deep, metallic groan echoed up through the mountain like something ancient shifting in the darkness below Blackthorn Valley. Then silence returned so suddenly it almost made her question whether she had imagined it at all. Snow swirled violently around the lookout tower. Clara stood frozen beside the old lantern, staring at the words scratched into the floorboards. He never left the mountain. Her fear should have sent her running back to the cabin. Instead, she felt something else. Sadness. Not fear of the mountain. Fear for Elias Mercer. Because for the first time, Clara realized his story had never really been about mystery or ghosts. It had been about loneliness. A man abandoned by the world who found one final purpose protecting a forgotten place no one else cared enough to save. And somehow, she understood him completely. Clara carried the lantern back down to the cabin as dawn slowly began breaking over the eastern ridges. The storm had finally passed, leaving the valley buried beneath untouched snow, glowing pale blue in the early morning light. Inside the station, she sat beside the fire wrapped in a blanket, unable to stop thinking about Elias's journals, about the hidden tunnels, the government survey team, the warnings, and most of all, the final message. He never left the mountain. Part of her wanted answers, but a deeper part already knew something important. Some mysteries don't exist to be solved. They exist to change the people who encounter them. And Blackthorn Mountain had already changed her. Over the following weeks, Clara stopped searching for proof. She stopped trying to explain every strange sound in the valley or every flicker of light in the tower after midnight. Instead, she focused on something simpler. Living. Really living. For the first time in years, Clara no longer measured her days by survival. She measured them by meaning. Morning coffee while sunlight spilled across the snow. The smell of pine wood burning inside the stove. The sound of ravens circling above the ridge. The quiet satisfaction of repairing something with her own hands. Little by little, Blackthorn transformed her. Or maybe it helped her become who she had always been underneath the fear and exhaustion. By spring, the valley began waking from winter. Snow melted from the lower trails. Streams roared with fresh runoff. Wildflowers pushed through the frozen earth around the cabin porch. And with the changing season came people. Not many, just a few hikers. Backcountry travelers. Lost souls wandering farther into the wilderness than most people ever dared. Some stayed only minutes. Others stayed hours listening to Clara's story beside the fire, and almost all of them said the same thing before leaving. There's something different about this place. Clara would simply smile, because she knew Blackthorn didn't just shelter people, it revealed them. One afternoon in late May, a young man arrived at the station exhausted and shaking after getting caught in an unexpected storm crossing the ridge. Clara gave him dry clothes, soup, and a place near the stove to sleep. The next morning, before leaving, he looked around the cabin quietly and asked, "How did you find this place?" Clara glanced toward the lookout tower standing beyond the trees. Then she answered honestly, "I think the mountain found me first." The young man laughed softly at first, then stopped, because deep down, he understood exactly what she meant. Months later, Clara finally made one last trip into town carrying several of Elias Mercer's old maps carefully protected inside waterproof wrapping. A collector paid her nearly $80,000 for part of the collection. Enough money to completely change her future. Enough to buy a house, a car, a normal life. But when the collector asked whether she planned to leave Blackthorn Valley now that she could afford something better, Clara smiled quietly, because people always misunderstood what better meant. The world believed success looked like crowded cities, expensive apartments, and busy lives filled with noise. But the mountain had taught her something different. Peace was wealth too. Purpose was wealth too. Feeling alive was wealth too. And Blackthorn had given her all three. So she returned to the ranger station. Not because she had nowhere else to go anymore, but because she had finally found somewhere worth staying. Years later, hikers passing through the Bitterroot Mountains would tell stories about a woman living deep in the wilderness near an old ranger station hidden beyond the ridges. Some claimed strange lights still appeared in the lookout tower after midnight. Others swore they heard voices in the forest during snowstorms. But almost everyone who met Clara Bennett said the same thing afterward. She seemed genuinely happy. Not the forced happiness people perform online. Not the temporary excitement money buys. Real peace. The kind most people spend their entire lives searching for and never find. And maybe that was the true secret hidden inside Blackthorn Mountain. Not buried tunnels. Not mysterious lights. Not forgotten government secrets. The real secret was this. Sometimes losing everything is the only thing that clears enough space for you to finally discover who you were meant to become. At 21 years old, Clara Bennett was homeless. She bought a condemned ranger station for $5 because she had nowhere else left to go. But in the silence of those mountains, she found a home. She found purpose. And most importantly, she found herself far above the valley. The old lookout tower still stands against the Montana sky. And on certain winter nights, when snowstorms roll through Blackthorn Valley and the wind moves through the pines just right, a warm, golden light can still be seen glowing softly from the top, as if someone is still watching over the mountain, waiting for the next lost soul to find their way home. At 21, Clara Bennett thought her life was over. Homeless, alone, and carrying only $5. She walked into the mountains believing she had nothing left. But the abandoned ranger station hidden in Blackthorn Valley gave her something the outside world never could. A reason to keep going. The greatest lesson of Clara's journey is this. Sometimes the world strips everything away because you were never meant to stay where you were. The cabin didn't magically fix her life. The mountains didn't erase her pain. But isolation forced Clara to rediscover something she had lost long ago. Her worth. In a world obsessed with money, status, and appearances, Blackthorn taught her that peace, purpose, and belonging matter more than comfort. And maybe that's why this story feels so personal to so many people. Because deep down, everyone is searching for a place or a purpose that finally feels like home. Clara's story reminds us that rock bottom is not always destruction. Sometimes it's redirection. Healing begins the moment you stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as unfinished. And often, the hardest road becomes the one that changes your life forever.